Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Berman Institute of Bioethics seminar series. This is the last seminar of the 22-23 academic year. So we look forward to seeing you next year. To introduce our final speaker of the year, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Catherine Beach.
Thank you, Deborah. I am excited to be introducing Dr. Tia Powell. Dr. Powell is the director of the Montefiore Einstein Center for Bioethics. She holds the Shoshana Trachtenberg-Frackman Chair in Medical Ethics and is professor of epidemiology and psychiatry at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Dr. Powell has served for 4 years as the executive director of the New York State Task Force on Life and Law, which was the New York State's Bioethics Commission. She has worked with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine on many projects. And in 2021, chaired the report committee for reaching the impact of a decadal survey of behavioral and social sciences. She is the author of the 2019 book, Dementia Reimagined, Building a Life of Joy and Dignity from Beginning to End by Penguin Random House. We are very excited to have Dr. Powell here. Her talk title today is Imagine This, Aging Happily in America. Thank you, Dr. Powell.
Thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be speaking with this group. I'm going to share my screen and show you the inevitable PowerPoint presentation. Let's see if I can pull that up and make it go into its right format. There we go. Whoops, starting with conflicts. That's no way to go. Okay. And I'm going to go from there. So hello, everybody. Quickly, there are no conflicts that are relevant to this demonstration. For good or ill, the views I express are my own. They're not informed by donations from various speaker agencies. And I don't make any medication recommendations, for authorized off-label or on. So what I'd like to talk with you about is the challenge of this concept called happy aging. I just taught a seminar in our bioethics master's program for the spring semester on this topic, and I had so much fun. It was such a rich discussion with the various different students. So I'm going to try and communicate with you some of the things that we thought about and talked about. For one, I'm quite intent on thinking about aging in a way that rejects the tragic view that this is the downhill slide. There's so many unappealing metaphors from, being past your prime to out to pasture. None of these seem to capture what I'm hoping to. On the other hand, I really kind of question what I'll call the Instagram approach, which is just aging is happy, happy, happy all the time. And if you can't perform that, then you're not a good aging person. So that's actually a burden that seems unappealing and unfair. What I'd like to do as we think together is to help identify a realistic path, or I should say realistic paths, because our paths will be different, that acknowledges challenges and facilitates joy for us as we age, which indeed we are all doing. So as I was thinking about how to sort of gather together my thoughts, I was lucky enough to read in the New Yorker, and actually I'm realizing a number of my references today are from the New Yorker because we suffer so much in academic medicine reading things that are really badly written, and I want to lean into actually reading things that are beautifully written as part of a message for us all today. In any case, I read a wonderful story by the poet and fiction writer Ben Lerner called The Fairy, which came out in the New Yorker maybe about a month ago. And the story is about a father of a young child, a little girl, and he's kind of struggling to get through a lot of the regular routine tasks of parenting. He's in New York City and he's got to get this kid from one place to another. And he's clearly feeling a little bit anxious because his separated wife obviously has found him really lacking in this. He's not good at it. He messes up and he's really worried about messing up. And at one point he goes into the subway in New York And Lerner writes this, in the whole story, by the way, is in the interior monologue of the main character. And he gets downstairs in the subway and he writes, underground, when I refilled my Metro card, the machine asked me if I wanted to add value or add time. And it's in that minute we realize this character is not just a regular struggling dad. He's actually kind of on the edge of psychosis, maybe sort of tipping over, because for him, this request from the MetroCard machine, he's like a horse or a dog that's startled by this sort of scary loud boom or something. He's completely deflected from his path. He totally loses track of the mission of getting his little kid to the place and not getting in trouble. And he goes off in this reverie about, oh my God, add value or add time? That's the question. He's totally lost. And I burst out loud laughing reading the story because it is actually the eternal question. And it's right there on our subway machines in New York City. So should we try to add value or time? Of course, the answer is always both if you can. And indeed, in terms of studying aging, we've had some success over the years in adding time to our lives. I'm going to argue that we've had less success in some ways with adding value. So how can we shift our focus to adding value, but without losing time? I'm not going to succeed if I'm going to argue to you that we should have less time, but maybe we can have more value. And what would that look like? So here's a quick overview. I'm going to do a brief sort of philosophical tour, thinking with you about what is happiness? What does that mean? What's aging? And what might be some ingredients for happy aging? So thinking about this, and I'm doing a very quick tour of enormous topics, so I apologize in advance. So what is happiness? There is literally an immeasurable amount of scholarly and popular literature on this topic. But I'm going to start at the very beginning, which is with Aristotle and Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle looks at and tries to define for us what is the art of living well. Importantly, happiness in that context, in the Nicomachean Ethics, is not a feeling. And if a feeling, certainly not pleasure alone. That really is not even an ingredient in his formulation. What he is writing about is activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. So this is less like the kind of performed happiness of Instagram, where we're led to believe that our friends' lives are an endless series of, hot dog roasts on the beach and, drinking games and running around and being in beautiful places with beautiful people. It's much more like the Scandinavians, who year after year are sort of decried to be the world's happiest people. When you go and interview the Scandinavians about, well, so what's that like? Their interviews are really delightful. It's sort of like, well, I have enough food to feed my family and my health's okay. And I don't have so much money, but I have enough. And really, I'm doing okay. It is the most measured, kind of quiet form of happiness. It's totally in no way Instagrammable. And that's what gets them the top score. So I think we need to learn and lean into that reformulation back to a more closer to the original definition of what we're talking about. You can't talk about happiness and living a happy life without thinking these days about positive psychology, which has really completely innovated and renovated a lot of psychological concepts. But I got to tell you, I'm a little bit ambivalent. So I'm going to take as an example the work of Seligman, specifically his book Flourish, which was from 2011. And that is one summation. There are many alternatives, but that's one summation about of what positive psychology has in mind. There is enormous benefit to all of us from positive psychology because the attention here is on a good life. Psychiatry, my own field, has really focused on mental illness. How shall we identify and treat, especially serious mental illness? That's good work. That's really important. And unfortunately, we have gotten not very far in resolving that issue. So there's plenty more to do there. But psychiatry, as a rule, has not really thought about, okay, if you're lucky enough not to suffer from serious mental illness, is that enough to just not be deathly ill? Shouldn't we think about what actually a good life would look like? And psychiatry has rarely really delved into that, with exceptions. But it's really positive psychology that has sort of brought this up and certainly into the popular domain. So in this book, Flourish, Seligman says, I don't like the word happiness. Let's just put that aside. Happiness is about, big smile. That's no good. He kind of disses Aristotle. That's okay. He can diss who he wants. It's his book. I don't agree. He instead, Seligman, focuses on well-being. And of well-being, there are several components. One is good feeling. The others are engagement, meaning, relationships, and accomplishment. This is not a formulation that makes me comfortable. I have a problem with both good feeling and accomplishment. I think they can be extremely problematic when folded into the concept of a good life. First of all, it is healthy to experience a range of feelings. We are not human if we don't acknowledge and feel sorrow and anger and loss when those are appropriate things. I would be horrified myself to produce a Facebook sort of photograph of me grinning and jumping up and down laughing if some terrible thing had just happened in my life, some loss of my dog, let alone of, a family member or some other thing. So good feeling is not the only thing that a full human should be feeling. You should be human and aware of and able to process all kinds of feelings. I also am troubled by accomplishment as an ingredient for a life well lived. I'm not opposed to accomplishment. I mean, I certainly was, if not a workaholic, sort of bordering on that from time to time. But I'm not aware that accomplishment is all that well correlated with happiness. Focus on winning can undermine the inherent value of the person and the value of effort and process. And I also am thinking about this in particular, and this is a story that everybody listening to this knows. We are aware of many colleagues, maybe even some listening, health professionals, incredibly successful, who are not happy, who may be quite depressed, who have been burned out, who've been deeply affected by the pandemic and all the other things that can happen in life, who are facing thoughts of suicidality, and even you may know some who have completed suicide. So those are incredibly accomplished people. We have failed them if we thought, oh, well, they just won the so-and-so prize. I certainly don't have to worry about her. Accomplishment is fine. There's certainly things that I've been lucky enough to do that I'm happy about. But I think we need to be very careful about what message we give to other people and to ourselves about the connection between measurable accomplishments that other people can see and whether or not we are okay in our own skins. We need a little more thinking on that. And those attitudes are very important in terms of what's going to make a happy aging life possible. So can Aristotle be updated for our contemporary life? Absolutely. And there are good people who have done work on that. I will go very quickly. Certainly inequity. Aristotle's plan, such as it was in the Nicomachean Ethics, was really all about the elite group of people in classical Greece for male landowners. Okay, that doesn't work for me. It doesn't work. None of us is a classical male Greek landowner, so I don't think it actually works for anybody who's listening today. One of the most powerful alternatives to that approach, I would say, is the capabilities approach, which has been spearheaded by authors like Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, and they argue in their work that to be happy, to have a flourishing life, everybody has to have access to a sort of a decent, not a minimum, a decent amount of the goods that make flourishing possible. If you fear for your life every day, you are not going to be able, say, to succeed in school or in your profession. So it isn't real. It's about maintaining a generous access to the things that can make a successful life, rather than limiting those to a very few, as was the case in Aristotle's time and conception. Further, Aristotle says that it is reason that makes us most human. And reason is one thing that makes us human. But again, as a psychiatrist, I'm uneasy with that formulation, because love is an unbelievably powerful and important component of human beings, not just in our deepest and most important relationships where that love can be the defining, an incredibly important aspect of life, but also in what I'll call our smaller relationships, just being kind to a woman ahead of you in a checkout line in a store whose 3 children are melting down. A little kindness, a little time would be a great gift to give. And it is that, I think, that makes people human. The final category I'll just mention really quickly is implementation. All right, so what Aristotle had in mind could really only be implemented by philosophers, and then that's nice for them, but it kind of fails really the test of Kant's categorical imperative. It isn't a good rule unless it's a rule that everybody everywhere can adapt. There may not be so many rules that fall in that category, but clearly feeling that you have to live as a philosopher king, that's not going to be available to too many. So we're hoping and thinking about a happy life as we age, or in general, for an approach that is at least potentially available to a large group within society, not just a handful of individuals. So what could we do today that builds on the insights of Aristotle and others about what makes a happy life? So a good life at any age. Again and again, the data suggests that relationships are unbelievably important. Vivek Murthy, our wonderful Surgeon General, for this tour of duty in that role, he's really leaning into challenges of loneliness and isolation, partly through his book, Together, but also through a lot of different programs and work that he's promoting and enhancing. Very important work. Robert Waldinger and his co-author, I think, is it Charles Schultz? I'll have to look that up, have recently published a summation of the findings from the Harvard Study of Adult Development, and they are exactly the same as the findings from previous books that were based on that long-running study, which is that people are happy when they're older are people who have really been able to focus on and maintain relationships. There's no other entity, there's no other component that is more likely to produce happiness, and certainly not success to push back against that component. There's certainly purpose and meaning. That's important to feeling that life is satisfying, and that kind of Scandinavian level of contentment, like this is good, not this is great. And I'd also add a sense of the future, a sense that one is still curious, trying to learn, trying to discover new things, and that there are positive expectations about time moving forward. I'll note the popular author Gretchen Rubin, who wrote a number of books about happiness and is still working this domain, has really focused on that sense of still learning, being on the learning curve. Okay, so that was a very quick summation of what is happiness. Now let's think for a minute about what is aging. Obviously, an incredibly trivial question in some ways, but also important for our work today. Literally, what I mean by aging is the physical and mental changes in the human body over time. I'm keeping it just factual, body neutral, as it were. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, it's what is. Our hair changes, like mine, your skin gets wrinkles, your muscle mass tends to decrease, and cognition can change. And this is one that many, many of us are particularly frightened about. Will I lose things that for me are defining of the self? Will I have either just normal changes in cognition with aging, or will I come up with dementia or one of the other serious illnesses that affect cognition? So if that's aging, what's anti-aging? This is a word that is flexible in its definition and has a number of different uses in popular discourse. For one, from the Ben Lerner rubric, it's about adding time. It's about preventing and treating illness, which is great. Efforts to delay the impact of aging. So we're all, as we get older, urged to lift weights, to resistance work, in order to fight the loss of muscle mass, and to increase health span, this new word, a relatively new word, of not just adding years, though that might be nice, but adding the period of time during which one is healthy, so increased health span. And in fact, in this domain, we've had quite significant public health and medical success in the last 100 years. We live a lot longer than we used to. The retirement age was set at 65 because that's more or less when people died. They thought, oh, get them to there, and if a few live it longer, we'll support them. They didn't realize that there are those among us who are planning to live till 90 to 100. But there's another sense of anti-aging, which is actually, I'm against aging. Aging's repugnant. So that part of anti-aging is maybe about adding value by decreasing the outward trappings of aging. Maybe it's about concealing. Maybe it's about dyeing your hair, which I obviously don't. It's about a multi-billion-dollar industry, not necessarily about increasing the health span, but about hiding aging. And it's a bit creepy at times, kind of youth-oriented, anti-aging people, anti-women for sure, and anti-diversity. So what about that? Well, it has a kind of absurd extreme, as many ideas do, with a focus on essentially an infinite lifespan, which ethically I find totally insupportable. This is the ultimate health inequity. No one who's interested in creating an infinite lifespan is actually thinking of doing that for everyone. They're thinking of doing it for a teeny tiny group who is already exceedingly privileged. There's a wonderful article, in my references, I have the full reference by Tad Friend from a few years ago, also from the New Yorker, about Silicon Valley's quest to live forever. In there, he describes a number of things, including something called the SENS Foundation, the Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. And their goal is to help various people live for 1,000 or more years, completely seriously with a straight face. Unity Biotech has claimed that it can beat all diseases. It's going to figure out how to do this. And you might be able to make fun of a few smallish organizations, but they have billions of dollars in funding, as did Calico, which was $1 billion Google offspring that decided that biology is just coding and you can hack any coding, so you can hack death, and so they won't have to die. Specifically, Sergey Brin should not have to die. It's like, okay, that's ridiculous. And I just, it's, I think it's unlikely to work. I also am deeply troubled by the expenditure of enormous sums toward this health goal. Today, actually, I believe it was in either JAMA or the New England Journal, and reading through the alerts I get on my email, there was a deeply unsurprising and upsetting article demonstrating that African Americans in the US have 1.6 million excess deaths relative to white Americans in the US over the last 20 years. It's something like 80 billion life years lost. We have shocking inequities in access to life survival and lived years among different groups in our society. Why are we not spending billions on that? I mean, we are, but these guys are not. Why isn't Silicon Valley spending its unbelievable zillions of dollars to crack that problem? So as an ethicist, I find the search for endless life distressing. As a psychiatrist, I do also, because that which we will lose, we love the more dearly. And thinking that you don't have to lose that the people you love, I think will set you off on a bad path. I'm not saying it will be easy, but I think better to value them because you might not have them with you later. Anyway, I wax too poetic. So let's continue on. What is ageism? As you all know, was coined by Robert Butler back in 1969 and is defined by him and generally as a prejudice against those of one age group, usually older people, by another age group. He was very specific about the analogy to racism. And he basically is saying that ageism attributes a loss of value specifically to those who are aging. You are less valuable because you are aging. So this brings us back to our contest between time and value. There are grave impacts from ageism. Notable in this category of documenting that is the work of Becca Levy from Yale, who published a book called Breaking the Age Code last year, and that book is really a summary of work that she's been doing over a decade and longer. Levy documents that there is a longevity advantage of 7.5 years for those with what she calls positive age beliefs. She basically asked quite a number of people, are you less useful as you grow older? And she controlled for gender, race, age, socioeconomic status, health, and loneliness. So what she found is actually that adding value to aging people can indeed add time. Her work is very startling. I'm never, when I read it, completely persuaded because the finding is so dramatic, but she has very good data and suggests as well that internalized ageism is as powerful as external ageism. So it's not only outside in the community, it's in us. So what then, if we think about it, is happy aging? What does that mean? It is a focus on value in the present and adding time where that's possible. There's a sense of being content, of flourishing. Relationships are clearly important, as are purpose and meaning, and a sense of future. Health is crucial in that, but I'll confess it's not the focus of my talk today. A year ago, during the academic year, I was lucky enough to spend half my time working with AHRQ on important work that they're doing on managing multiple chronic conditions, which affect the majority of Medicare payees. So this is incredibly important. We need better integration of the healthcare system. We need better communication among providers, patients, and families. And I absolutely stress that that's really important. But it's not my focus today because happiness doesn't require perfect health, which is good because we can't have perfect health. And even terminal illness may not preclude happiness. Further, happiness generally arises from domains that are external to health, so that we do need health, and we certainly need an adequate income so that we can be secure in knowing we'll have enough food to eat and a safe place to live, goals which we have not met for every American and not even for every aging American. I'm going to note that, but focus on some other issues. Right, so how can we add value as we age through modifiable factors? All right. In the course that I was teaching on happy aging, I have to say the nuns that we read about in one particular article were essentially the hero of the course, the heroes of the course. These are not those nuns. These nuns in the photograph were cheering the Tour de France in 1969, and they look very jolly indeed as the cyclists go racing by. The nuns were very interesting to my students because they succeeded in connection and purpose and contentment and certainly in spirituality without doing any of the things that successfully aging people are supposed to do. So that's a paradox. I'm taking here insights from an article by Anna Corwin in her chapter, Growing Old with God, which comes from the book Successful Aging. So she did an anthropological study of 150 aging Franciscan nuns in the US. And as I say, they met success, but they didn't do the things you're supposed to do. In other authors' work, control is very important for success, but these nuns really weren't that interested in control. They were big on acceptance. They demonstrated extraordinary serenity in the face of bad diagnoses, even impending death. Rather than really stressing independence and insisting on their independence, they embraced interdependence. If I had to think of any one thing that my students most referred back to during the entire semester, it was this one anecdote. There were two nuns, I'll make up their names. One, Sister Mary, had increasingly severe arthritis that it meant it was fairly painful for her to walk. But the other sister, Sister Alice, had dementia. And when the author, Anna Corwin, interviewed them each separately, Sister Mary with arthritis said, "It is a bit uncomfortable for me to keep taking our walk around the beautiful grounds of the convent every evening. But Sister Alice with dementia can't really find her way anymore. So this is my service to her. I do this, I embrace this. It's a lovely thing that I can still contribute to her in this way." But when you go and interview Sister Alice with dementia, she says, Sister Mary's arthritis is really getting to her and getting her down. She can't really make it on our evening walk around the grounds unless she has me to lean on. So, you know, it's really my act of service, and I'm willing to do it because it keeps her going. And they loved the two nuns. I kept referring back to them in their sense of still contributing and belonging and of finding their purpose in actually helping each other and maintaining their community. Well, since I had such a female example, I thought I ought to bring in a male example, and there arrived on my email doorstep a wonderful article published by Reuters in April about a new soccer league in Japan. So Japan obviously is a rapidly aging nation. A third of them are over 65, 20% over 70 are still working. And Japan started a recreational soccer league for people 50 and over some years ago. It was so popular, they had to add on after a bit 60 and over, then 65 and over. And now they've worked their way up. So they've just started a new 80 and over recreational soccer league in Japan. And the photographs from this article were just fabulous. I loved every minute of it. So the article is 80 is the new 50, and it focuses on this group of former national players. So these were expert soccer players. They are 80 to 93 in this particular competitive league. And they reminded me a lot, actually, of Ted Lasso. You know, soccer is life. These guys are adding value and time. So this guy in the red jersey falling down, I believe, is Shingo Shinazawa, who's 93, who told the interviewer, if I hadn't played soccer, I'd be dead by now. He's clearly embracing risk, this guy. He's 93, falling through the air. And the other player, I believe, is he has a different name. The daughter is Yoriko Nomura. I believe this is the 83-year-old Nomura. And his daughter said of him, I really admire him. I hope to be like him and continue playing when I'm older. So she's not saying, Dad, don't do this. You have to stay home. You're going to break your hip. He might break a hip, but he has an incredible time. These guys love being together. They love the fellowship, the structure, and the running around and being joyful. Well, it's not only happening in Japan, actually. This is a US team. And I've translated, you know, soccer is about not giving up, about doing your best. There is an attempt to actually kind of minimize the sole focus on safety. They don't want to be unsafe, but they don't focus only on safety, and they've gained better health. And I think there's an important insight here. And this, again, Vivek Murthy is really focused on this. Men have a harder time addressing loneliness. They, you know, uncomfortable going to therapy, uncomfortable going to a group that's specifically to address loneliness. But a lot of men played sports, not all, but a lot played sports and liked teams. So you can have less loneliness for men, maybe with teams. So this particular team is the Geezers, which is the recreational soccer league of my husband. You can barely see him. He's this guy back here. What you probably can't see is that he's holding a bottle of champagne, because this was the celebration on his birthday. Whenever anybody has a birthday, they get to drink about a thimbleful of whatever's on offer. There are a lot of Irish guys, and they always do Irish whiskey. It was a very international group. It's across classes. There are neurosurgeons, there are bartenders, there are physical therapists. There's a lot of different sorts of people there. It's very international too, because soccer is an international game. And it has been an incredible lifeline. These guys all have private lives. Many have spouses, kids, whatever. But this network, one ring out, has been unbelievably important to them. I'm fascinated by the Geezers. This is not Anthony Fauci, though. It looks a little bit like him, a Fauci wannabe. So I'll just say that about relationships, both small and large. I'm going to move on now, because community actually needs a place to be. Well, housing, I think, is actually quite important in figuring out how we shall be happy as we grow older. There are a lot of efforts, including some great efforts done by people at Hopkins, to help older people stay in the community. But some older people are saying, what community? My adult children are gone. They've left the place where I raised them. They can't get jobs here. My neighbors are gone. My home is now too big. Or for single people, I didn't have a big home. And anyway, as I get older, I'm not sure I want to maintain the home that I lived in for all these years. So what to do? There are a lot of different options here. Well, if the nuns were the hero of my class, probably the villain was Margaritaville. I don't know if you guys have heard about Margaritaville. It's not just one place. It's a series of communities in Florida that are immensely popular. You can't build them fast enough. They label themselves as age 55 and better. Big focus on lots of games. Everybody drives around in golf carts. They have costume rooms in their houses because they're constantly doing costume things. Many of the people living at Margaritaville are former Blue State Union workers, so they have a pretty solid pension benefit that allows them to buy homes that are usually in the $300 price range, around in there, so they can afford to live there. But it has some features that are less than positive. So there's no kids. You're not allowed to have somebody permanent living there who's less than 55. You can't raise your grandkids there. Too bad, because there are 250,000 children in America who lost their parents during COVID. They're not going to be raised by these grandparents, not while they live in Margaritaville, as far as I know. I mean, they've basically celebrating daytime drinking in the title of the community. I was kind of hoping to avoid that as I get ready to work less, but maybe not. But these communities are enormously popular. They're all in Florida. And there's a fascinating article, which I think some of the fellows and I will discuss later, by Nick Palmgarten, also from the New Yorker. But he takes a quote, which I found particularly disturbing, which was, if you can't be happy here, you can't be happy anywhere. It's almost like a curse. If you don't fit in here, you just don't want to be happy. But my students didn't want to be there. So, what's that about? So let's think about this. Why did the people at Margaritaville, why did they like it so much? And as Nick Palmgarten at least describes it, they love it there. They really do. I think a lot of it is community. People are lonely, and at Margaritaville, they're not lonely. A lot of people are lonely, not there. They've got stuff to do. It's so welcoming. You can join anything. There's structure, there's activity. And you know what? It's okay to be old. There's no bias against older people because we're all kind of in the same age batch here. So that's really nice. And you live really well. You also live just like your neighbors. There's a very significant leveling effect, which I find very interesting. I think one of the toxic things about social media that we see is that, and particularly adolescents, I think, are vulnerable to this, but there's this constant notion that somebody else is living better than you. Well, at Margaritaville, there's basically only a couple of different types of houses, and they're all more or less equivalent. They also like it because there's low taxes. When you exclude children, you don't have to pay for schools. Schools are expensive. So it's a low tax state, which is, again, not really consistent with Kant's categorical imperative. We can't all do that. So why did my class not like Margaritaville? Is it just because there's sort of, grumpy, boring nerds from the Northeast? They don't want to have fun and live in Florida? I don't think so. They really didn't like no kids. The younger people in the class, my class is mostly, as it goes from 20s to 60s. It's actually quite a range of ages in there. Nobody was happy with the no kids. People who were or were about to be grandparents thought that was appalling. But even people who had no kids or young kids thought that's kind of sad. And nobody liked the no minorities, no diversity. What is that? They don't do it explicitly in their code, but there's something about the place that ends up being no minorities being there. So what is that? There's also something that we'll call the cruise ship mentality, which was disturbing to them. What are the values that you see there? At least in this article, we see nothing about service, about giving back, about purpose, about sharing of expertise. The values are kind of, I want to get, I want to have a really good time, which isn't bad, but if you only do that, it seems a little, it was certainly unappealing to my students, I'll put it that way. Also, what happens when you age out in a red state that doesn't invest in nursing homes and in BNS and in lots of other things, you may be in trouble when you're no longer able to play pickleball. So maybe my students didn't like it because of class bias. Maybe they're more educated, they're all in a master's program, many are professionals, maybe they're more intellectual, but I don't think it's only my class. There's an interesting pushback against the notion of age segregated housing. And there are a couple of different alternatives to that. One is what's called co-housing, which is matching, in this case, matching older people who have excess housing to younger people, often students, who have limited funds. Interestingly, the two loneliest groups in the US are young adults and older adults, in that order. So here's a way of bringing together two lonely groups and seeing if they can help each other. And it seems that they can. There's one business enterprise, a nonprofit, I believe, called Nesterly, based in Boston, which has lots of students and lots of lovely old homes. They do screening and matching, and people can exchange chores for all or part of the rent, but they also exchange wisdom and affection and meals. And it seems actually to be really interesting. I don't know how broadly it's spreading. I don't know if it can be scaled up nationally, but it's a fascinating experiment to me. Mark Friedman is the CEO or the co-CEO of CoGenerate, who's really focused on intergenerational housing as a way forward to address a number of problems: isolation, purpose for those of us who are aging, thinking about making integrated communities where people feel they can flourish as they age. Friedman has written in one of his pieces, we, the US, started the 20th century as one of the most age-integrated societies in the world and ended it as the most age-segregated. So every age group in its own home, that was not the norm throughout history. That was an odd phenomenon at the end of the 20th century. And there's a lot of pushback from baby boomers against that. So that intergenerational housing can be viewed by them as healthier physically and psychologically. And there's certainly, during the pandemic and even now post-pandemic, has been a significant increase in the US in multi-generational housing. So I'll show you a few developments. Again, these, I don't know how successful they'll be, if they can be scaled up, but there was something I didn't know about until I started looking into this, and I find them interesting, so I'll share them with you. This is a development multi-generational plan for Buda, Texas, which is supposed to open shortly, specifically stating shared values about respect, about working together, about being different and welcoming different sorts of people, absolutely older people, but all generations, and very specifically including LGBT people, which I think are also in short supply in Margaritaville. The houses are relatively modest, but they're beautiful, very tall ceilings, light. Everybody has a little dedicated outdoor space. So again, you live kind of like your neighbors, but it's very communal. There's a walkable downtown in the rest of the community, the larger community, and they have a communal great house. So that's a very planned, intentional community. Another example is this Agri-hood in Santa Clara, California, which has about, 320 lower income and mixed income houses, plus 36 townhouses, which I think are market rate. But they've incorporated a 1.5 acre farm into their design, which will be the focus of all kinds of activities intergenerational. You can work on a farm, you can pull weeds, you can water, you can help choose what they're going to plant. You can help, provide that stuff to people living there and selling it, through their communal space. And it's actually been a very important piece of their attempting to address homelessness in their community. So very excited about that. So housing, we're in trouble in every way in housing. There are too many homeless people. That shouldn't be possible. This is an area of very active investigation. What can we do here? Some people are thinking about conversion of the abandoned office spaces that are in many of our great cities, certainly in New York City, conversion of abandoned shopping malls, which are also many, many in suburban and rural areas, and offering better supports to people who want to stay at home, regardless of where they are. So there's a lot of work being done. Let me quickly shift then, because I think we're getting toward the end of time, to questions of work and identity. Retirement is sometimes seen as disaster, but it shouldn't be. It should be normalized. It's one of many transitions throughout life. So how can we, as we shift 100% of our effort from paid work to recapture parts of our identity and main purpose, maintain our sense of purpose as work life evolves? Well, there are some grave limits to the notion that your work is your identity. There's an excellent short article by Yana Koretz in the Harvard Business Review. She does a case study of a successful law partner, and he is at the top of the game, and he is miserable. He hates what he does. He's completely unsatisfied. He's burned out. He doesn't even want to go back for one more day. The problem for him is he has no identity aside from work. He has spent all his time becoming a successful law partner, and his family life has eroded, and he himself has eroded. The man is in a bad way. So this is part of my problem with too much focus on success. I'm not opposed to success. I graduated from Yale Law School. I didn't just stumble in there. I actually worked hard to get there and was proud of that. But it can reward things that are not good for you. It can certainly reward a bad work-life balance. And although Yana Koretz takes a law partner as her example, I am sure we can all easily identify, perhaps in ourselves, health professionals who have the same problem, that this focus on success can deplete the rest of your identity, undermine your relationships and the non-work value of you, making it unbelievably brutal for you to switch away from work when that's what's appropriate for you. Now, for some people, They'll just keep working while they age. And for some happy academics, that's absolutely true. There are people who say, I love my work so much, I cannot imagine quitting. I don't have to, I'm not going to. It's great for me. Okay, that's not true for everybody. For some people, they would love to quit work, but if they do, they will starve or they won't have housing. So this is obviously something that hits people very differently across the spectrum of class and finance. But aging societies really encourage prolonged work life. Japan, it's greater than 20%. It's very similar in Korea and China, and we're going to have to go there too. So more people will probably have to work as our population ages, which it does. So we better think about how are we going to do that and still maintain some degree of contentment and happiness. So I read with interest the recent National Academy of Medicine Global Roadmap for Healthy Longevity. It has some great things in it and really focuses on increased health span. But the natural resource that they describe older people as is only true if those older people are working longer. And man, is that an unpopular policy? Look at what's happening in France with increasing attempts to increase the retirement age from 62 to 64. The whole country's ground into a halt. And that challenge is going to face, probably every country is going to consider raising the retirement age. It's going to be very rough on vulnerable people who really cannot continue working. But many governments are appropriately afraid of whether or not, if the population of older people increases, can they provide sufficient support to make sure people are not hungry and too poorly housed. So going quickly toward the end, then, what are some partial solutions? And people have talked about a third age, where there's a period where you may not want to focus entirely on work, but you actually still have a lot of energy. It can do a lot of things before you really need a lot of support and protection. For any view of happy aging and happy life generally, relationships has to take pride of place. Housing, I think we can do more with that to help people feel that they belong in communities that are accessible, that are welcoming to them. And rethinking our focus on work, purpose, success, all of that, I think, can be helpful for us as we think about having happy older lives, which may permit us to rediscover other identities, contributions of joy, for instance, through the arts, community building, through gardening, which has been a great source of joy for me. And in conclusion, we absolutely need decent health and adequate money, but these are necessary but not sufficient. I hope we can begin to look at aging as a new chapter, not a cataclysm, full of curiosity and exploration and learning, in which we can maintain a sense of home and community, maintain intergenerational connections, and maybe add time, but surely add value in our own ideas and those of others. So there's Ben Lerner's Metro card. All right, I'll stop sharing there. Okay.
Thank you so very much. If you could hear us all, we'd be clapping. I don't think that we planned this intentionally as the last seminar before summer, but I think it was incredibly well chosen as our academic year commitments decrease and meetings go away and we have more time perhaps to think more broadly. So folks in the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A and we can take those as they come. Perhaps I'll start with maybe an anecdote and a question. So I have, my parents and in-laws have all now retired and they have done so in different ways. My father, who's an academic, has continued to work. My mother-in-law has, as you sort of just suggested, worked her way through a series of arts she was interested in, right? Sort of getting excellent at each of them and then turning to something new. Although we don't, at least I find it hard in the midst of a career to focus attention there. I mean, you're talking to a group of academics, right? Broader than that, but academics, academically interested people here at a university that is has a lot of workaholics.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, what do you have practical suggestions?
Well, you'll tell me how practical this is. There are different ways of thinking about this. When a million years ago, I wrote my undergraduate thesis under the supervision of a guy who was visiting, a professor who was visiting from MIT named Howard Gruber, a psychologist. And I was writing thinking about the poet Elizabeth Bishop and her life and how that connected to her work in poetry and the themes in her poetry, which was totally fun and had so little to do with psychology in my department. I can't believe they let me get away with that, but it was a blast. And so Howard Gruber's contribution in psychology, he had been a biographer and done a lot of different things. He used to write about a network of enterprise that any one person has. So it may be that in your youth and childhood, you loved to write poetry. But then you grow up and you think, that's not remunerative for many, so maybe I need to think about something different. Still, I love poetry. And so you go off and you do what you're going to do. You become a professional, you try your best, you have to get a roof over your head and food on the table, and maybe you have kids and all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't mean that's not still part of you and in there. And there may be times even when you're in the thick of battle, trying to get your career off the ground and raise your family and feed yourself and keep from going bonkers, where you still turn to that. But it may be that you can go back there, that identity is still part of you and still an important part that you can joyfully find again, like an old friend that you knew in third grade and haven't seen for decades. You can re-find your old friend from whatever it was that you used to do. And that should be a joyful reunion. It shouldn't be, oh my God, she's taking up pottery now. That's completely ridiculous. It shouldn't be embarrassing. It shouldn't be, oh, she had a big job in her. Why isn't she doing that? I think I'm very troubled by some notions about success and what that means. It's clearly something that's been important to me, but I have to tell you, I'm not sure that to the extent that I've been driven by success, that's always been the thing that's made me happy in life. So what is that? And I don't think I'm alone there. I'm not saying we should all be hermits and go live on a hill. But I think we need, since we're so smart, all us academics, we could use a little bit of our smartness to thinking about what are our goals and what are our goals more broadly. And we don't have to do everything right now. You do have to write papers. You do have to get your kids to school if you've got kids. You've got stuff to do. But you maybe you want to put a pin in some things that you'd like to come back to. And that you won't give up, but you'll still be loyal to them in your heart, and you'll come back to them later. So I would say that. Is that practical? I don't know, but that's kind of how I think about it.
No, I think that's a wonderful and right suggestion. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A and one in the chat, but the first is about continuing care retirement communities. And then there's also one in the chat about aging in place. I wonder if you could engage both of those ideas in an answer.
Sure. Absolutely. So continuing care retirement communities, I totally didn't talk about it all today. You're absolutely right. I think that those can be great. I think there are many of them and they vary in terms of their approach and, for me, their appeal. So I think there's some continuing care retirement communities that permit members of a pair who are at different levels of disability to stay living in the same place. And that I think is fantastic. I think it's very hard when there's one relatively able and vigorous partner and another one in significant help. It's very expensive and complicated to get substantial assistance in your home, and in some locations, in rural locations, it may be flat out impossible, simply cannot be done. So to have a place where you can be together, but that you can kind of, as if you were off going to jobs, you can sort of go to different programs during the day and do different things. One of you might be in a kind of supervised adult daycare that would be pleasant and fun, and that would be great. And the other might be able to go off and do different things. Doesn't have to provide hands-on care, be, really locked into making sure the home attendant comes through. So I think they can be wonderful. I think there are some continuing care communities that have not cracked the code on how to not make people feel bad when they become more disabled, so that they don't want the person who has trouble with standard table manners to be at the house and to be at the table in the main dining room. They don't want somebody with more advanced Alzheimer's there who needs helping. That's scary, makes us worry about where we'll be. So I think there's some that really, they keep your other person around, but kind of segregated in a way that I think is unforgiving. And that's not just, that's terrible segregation that goes with dementia and other things. I get it. It's really frightening, but it's so hurtful and so harmful and so isolating for not just the person with dementia, but the person who loves them. So I think they vary. I think they can solve some wonderful purposes. And then, which is this, where, do you want me to go to the chat? Where's the other question?
So Mary Catherine asked about aging in place, but that there are challenges with that. And has anyone considered creating community networks for older adults who still want to live as independently as possible? Sort of a network of people who can come help or create social events, etc.
Yeah, there's some really interesting efforts with that. There are definitely networks in Westchester County, which is this sort of county outside of New York City. There's a wonderful network where they do ride sharing. They can take people to doctor's appointments. And there are versions of that in lots of places. In rural areas, it's particularly important because lots of people can't or should not drive. And if you're in the Northeast, that may be, or lots of places in the country, that may include months where there's snow on the ground and all kinds of other things, but you may still need to go see your doctor for CHF. So there are places that are trying to do that. And there are some people who managed to stay at home for a long time really well. I was talking the other day to a family member of a woman who is 96 years old. She has 86 descendants. She lives in a small town in upstate New York where 3 of her quite adult, all retirees, children live. One of them calls her every day. The other 2 go back and forth. And she has a person come in, stay with her during the day. And she has a child who takes her off to church on Sundays. It's hard for her to move around. She's really content. She's pretty cognitively with it. In fact, partly because she's religious and she prays for each of those 86 descendants by name every night. So she still remembers everybody's name and can tell you, Mary Ellen is the daughter and the cousin. She's better than anyone else of those 86. She's got it because she goes through the whole list. So there are people who are, she's lucky. She obviously worked hard to get those 86 descendants and was lucky in addition. But she has a family network that's able to do a lot for her. They also have paid help, which they can do, and they live in an affordable community where she can stay in her home and it's safe, and she's got kids and grandkids and lots of different people coming through. So I think there are people who love that and can do that. And I know some other people who have managed to do that too, right through to the end. But we need to make that a possibility. And there are a number of communities that are trying to do that. Sort of there's the village concept, not the villages, which is the retirement community in Florida, but the village concept, which started out on Beacon Hill in Boston, but which is a network of people that are trading resources and offering them and can help people with, I need a lawyer, I need somebody to come and fix the broken front step on my house, and just sort of getting people together, and also rides, transportation's hard. So I think that's really positive. And it's something you can build in a local community and start to get together. So I think those are super positive. Who else?
Great. So there's we only have 1 minute left. And we've had a number of questions added in the last few minutes. So maybe to change tack a little, from Nathaniel Lipschitz, I really enjoyed the talk. I agree with a lot of what you said. So I wonder if the goal is really happy aging rather than good aging.
So you have to pick a word. And There are lots of books about the good life and this, that, and the other. I'm going to stick with happy because a lot of people have rejected it, but I think that's the word that people want you to address and answer. I try to qualify what I mean by that, which is really about a full life, a life that's flourishing, but not a life where you pretend to be happy all the time. That's toxic. That's only can be performed. That can only ever be false, to pretend you're happy. That's not the goal, because it's one that we can never reach. It's fine to set a goal high, but don't make it so that people feel bad when they're normal. So I would like to claw back the word happy and say it's not about being on a rager 24, it's not about being on a cruise in the Bahamas 24/7. It's about feeling I'm okay in my skin. So that's the message. And I want to do it by pushing on happiness. I may be wrong. You're right. You may have to pick another word. Happy is just like too messed up. I'm going to go for that. So that's what I mean by it.
So I'm going to try to get one last one in here, which is from Gail Geller, who said she wants to follow up on lots of your points, but the one thing that she wanted to push on was how you view accomplishment.
Yeah.
You said it's often judged externally, but can't accomplishment be an internal experience? When I retire, I want to learn a foreign language. If I do, I will feel a huge sense of accomplishment, but it's different from the accomplishment one feels from getting a grant or writing a book.
Yeah, I completely agree, Gail. So I think particularly for people who've been good at school, but for lots of people doing different things, there is a wonderful joy and mastery in whatever thing, whether it's cooking or bread baking or gardening or learning a language. That actually can be very positive. And I love the idea of learning and accomplishment, but it's partly about, I would rather have us focus on the process. I like the Japanese phrase, sort of ganbatte ne, which just means like try, just like go for it. That's the part I want us to focus on. I think we are doing some dangerous things to people by focusing too much on this, as you say, externally measured and moderated accomplishment. But I also want to say, just hitting those steps, it can make you feel good, but it should be a goal that actually hits your values. And there are many goals that are celebrated by society that are not necessarily good for you or good for you in relation to the people that you love and care about. So I want us to question accomplishment. I'm not opposed to accomplishment. I'm a workaholic. I went to Harvard and Yale. I mean, it's like I didn't just like fall in there. I worked hard to do that. So I'm ambivalent about accomplishment, about what we mean by that, about the benefits and also sometimes the detriment. So I also plan to do lots of things. I'm trying all kinds of crazy new things, including, re-upping my language skills. But I want to do that in a reflective fashion. That is not about, I'm not trying to make money. I'm not trying to be famous for it or not necessarily even draw other people's attention to it. It's sort of because it's fun. It's the thing itself. It's because it's enriching. It makes me feel like, oh, that's good for my brain. That feels good. So it's that I'm really driving that. I'm not anti-accomplishment. I don't want us to sort of, sit back and chew on gummies and just admire the sunset all day. And maybe sometimes you could do that. It's not my style. So that's not what I'm arguing for. But yeah, it's an important discussion to think about. What does accomplishment mean to you? What is it that you want from this? And what are there some things that maybe haven't been good for you in the past that you should reconsider? That's what I really want us to think about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are out of time, but I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate your talk. Thank you, everyone online, for joining us, and we'll see you in the fall. Have a lovely summer.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.